Come into this place, bringing all you hold with you, though your heart be heavily burdened, whether you be on the brink of tears or burn with unquenchable rage. This community can hold you and your strongest emotions. Yes, even the messy ones are welcome here. Come in if you sing just a bit too loud, if you hold still as statues and just breathe it in. If you sway to the music moving your soul, you are welcome. Come in and say amen when the Spirit moves you. Tell that preacher to preach, yes, preach. Tell us. Or close your eyes and quietly let your mind float free on the blessed words. Come into this place with every piece of yourself gathered up, and let us be the church incarnate. Let us bring forth the Spirit of all that we love by the words of our mouths and the doing of our hands as we make sacred this time together. Our first reading this morning kind of continues this spirit of prayer, a prayer of all that we are, adapted from Robert Walsh. We are wondrously wrought, partly shaped by our biology, partly shaped by our culture, and partly self-shaped. We are so wonderfully fashioned that the workings of ourselves amaze and confuse us. We know we have the power to choose among many paths, yet most of the time we are on automatic pilot, acting out of little examined assumptions, values, rituals, myths, appetites, and impulses. We can meet life in many ways. We can be tough-minded. We can be tender-hearted. We can move between activity and quietness. We can express our uniqueness and individuality, and we can forget ourselves in commitment to family and community. We can judge. We can bear witness to the good and the evil around us, and we can forgive. We can analyze, theologize, figure the world out, and we can listen to the still, small voice of conscience, intuition, the Holy Spirit. All these ways of meeting life and more are a part of the potential that is us. But we are afraid to move very far or very fast from the ways that have become comfortable. We seek the self-knowledge that may illuminate new possibilities in life and seek the courage to try them. Most of all, we pray for wholeness, for a life in which our many ways of living can be connected and filled with the meaning of holy creation.
Our second reading comes from The Inherent Wholeness of Every Being by Erica A. Hewitt. We who are Unitarian Universalists not only affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we also affirm the inherent wholeness of every being, despite apparent brokenness. No one hearing these words is a stranger to pain or the knowledge that things break or break down, promises, friendship, sobriety, hope, communication. This breaking happens because our human hearts and our very institutions are frail and imperfect. We make mistakes. Life is messy. Brokenness happens. We're intimately acquainted with brokenness. Then, even as we believe that no matter how fractured we are or once were, we can make whole people of ourselves. We are whole at our core because of the great, unnameable, sometimes inconceivable love in which we live. As UUs, we believe that paying attention to something is an act of love. Witnessing and naming brokenness is how we begin to heal it. Some sorrows demand to be named out loud. My sister died. My body is fragile. I'm scared that I won't be able to pay my rent this month. The streets in my city are filled with violence. Healing begins when we examine what's in pain, wonder how it occurred, and allow it to teach us. In fact, sometimes the brokenness is immense, and the only grasp, the only power we have over that large and complicated pain looming over us is to bear witness, to tell its story, and to seek out companions and helpers who are willing to agree that, yes, there is something breaking or messy in front of us, and we will not leave or even look away until repair has begun. If love begins with attention, repair takes the form of compassion, bearing witness, speaking out. Repair looks like connection, justice, or even revolution. It looks like after-school tutoring programs, community meals, and holding signs in front of City Hall. And it begins by placing full trust and faith that there is inherent wholeness in every broken situation.
Over the last couple of years, we have seen the power of stories told and the tragedy of stories not told. Stories of brokenness, healing, and sometimes wholeness. The Me Too stories, the Black Lives Matter, Black Lives UU stories, the stories from the kids at Douglas High in Parkland, Florida, have shown us the power of sharing stories from the broken places in our lives. That power has forced resignations, firings, created rallies, and change of all sorts. Last month, with the deaths of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, we also see the tragedy of stories left untold by isolation, depression, and just the plain fact that sharing these stories can be hard. This past week, I watched a Netflix comedy special from Hannah Gadsby. Perhaps you've heard of it or seen it too. It's been widely featured in the last few weeks as a powerful example of someone owning and telling their story, and not just the good bits of the story, but all of it. She begins by telling the jokes from her story, and then slowly adds more and more of the parts after the jokes end. The power of her story is in that rest of the story. The pain, the anger, the brokenness, and above all, the resilience and the growth. I highly recommend you check it out if you can. As we just heard in this morning's second reading, brokenness happens. Naming that brokenness with faith and the inherent wholeness within each of us and in the broken situations themselves is the path toward healing and wholeness. So we will go there this morning, go into our brokenness, into the lessons within our brokenness, go into the healing that gets us to the other side, and the faith that there even is another side toward wholeness to get to. As I tell part of my story here, I am aware that this is yet another story from a straight, white, cisgendered male, and we've had plenty of those through the years, and perhaps we don't necessarily need another. But it is my hope and intention that in telling you my story in this way and in this place, you will be encouraged to tell your story in your way and in your particular place. Bolstered by our Unitarian Universalist first principle of affirming and promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and my own rock-solid conviction that I am a good person, I too often fail to consider that I can act in ways that cause suffering to others. Act like I don't need any healing. Act like it is always the other person who needs healing or care or service. A couple of years ago, when going into a spiritual exercise of reading a passage in the Christian scriptures that asked me to imagine myself somewhere in the story. The passage in this case was a Jesus story talking to and healing a leper. I immediately put myself in the Jesus character. I'm a minister, I like to help people, I serve people, I am that good person. Why not be Jesus? But then an interesting thing happened. A thought popped into my head. What if you're the leper? That simple question set me on a path of discovery which started with wrestling with sin and my own sinfulness in particular. Now, I just threw out a word there that in UU circles sometimes ripples. So just as an aside, we have an uneasy history with that word sin and other sins from the Christian tradition, which has not always been kind to some of us. One former minister of mine went back to the Jewish tradition and defined sin as simply missing the mark. We seek to do good and act appropriately, but we don't always make it. We fall short in small ways and in big ways and every which way in between. I like to think of sin as a rupture of relationship, of creating a chasm between myself and others. So for today, when you hear the word sin, translate as needed so you don't get stuck there. I know that is easier said than done in some cases, but just do the best you can. So as I began to reflect on my own capacity to sin, to rupture my relationships, my thoughts went back to how I processed or failed to process my dad's death in 2013. I preached on that grief here in 2014, just after our former and founding minister, Reverend Hamilton, retired, and I coupled that with the grief that you might feel individually and as a congregation at his departure. As I preached that Sunday, the grief that had been kept at bay for most of that first year came rushing in. As I looked back on the next year or two after that sermon, I realized I committed many sins of omission. As a fairly extreme introvert, I do a lot of my processing internally. In extreme situations, that turns into a lot of silence, and relationships can't survive and thrive in silence very long. On top of that, when anger and grief and frustration built up, I had no way to articulate it or get it out in healthy ways. In my head, I thought I was being such a great actor, not letting on about all the swirl going on within me. Turns out I'm not that good of an actor after all. Those emotions came out in subtle ways and left those around me confused and hurt about what was going on and why I was so mad at everything. As the reflection continued, more and more specific behaviors, all those ways I chose to cope with the swirling emotions within me, came to my awareness. I felt like I needed some help sorting through it all. And I sought out counseling, and shortly thereafter ended up in a 12-step program. As you may know, that first step involves admitting you are powerless over your addiction. And as someone who has spent about 20 years now trying to find my voice, find my leadership, my service in the midst of being quiet, and just trying to figure out how to minister and be in the world, I felt I was now being asked to undo all that, and I fought it hard. Luckily, I did know some things and learn along the way that mostly I was not in any hurry. As long as I kept showing up and doing the honest reflections and being open to whatever emerged, it didn't matter how long it took. Slowly, over weeks and months, I came to understand how little control I do have over things, especially other people, their feelings, their reactions, and situations in general. I did manage to carve out a little power and also to figure out the larger limits of that power. I am still you after all, and I can't give up being stubborn all at once. The steps continue to include diving deep into ourselves for a fearless moral inventory. This is where, as we circle back to our second reading today, we start to look at our brokenness, finding the lessons that lie within. Again, through many weeks and months in counseling and in group meetings and working with my sponsor and lots of praying and reflecting, I discovered that most of my issues stemmed from three main habits: fear, control, and judgment. I have lived most of my life in fear. Fear of strong emotions, fear of other people's emotions and reactions, fear of being found out, on and on. And out of that fear, I've tried to control so much around me, waiting for the absolute perfect time to talk with someone about something. And of course, that perfect time never comes. I always try to control my interactions. I even realized that my ministry is based in part on a job choice that allowed me to control this interaction right here. I get to craft my message, to shape it, and you can't do anything about it until I'm done. And then when everyone else did not live up to the level of control and near perfection, I can be rather judgmental. I am the embodiment of that internet nugget that says when I see a typo online, I look at the keyboard to see if the letters are close enough together that I can forgive the typo or not. That's judgmental. So getting to name and face all of that eventually gave me the ability to release it all. I wish I could say I released it all once and forever, but of course I have to continually become aware of what I am doing and why, and release it over and over again. I also return to our first principle often. In the midst of looking at these defects of character, I, at the same time, affirmed all the things I get right. I am mostly kind, a little funny, generous, forgiving, humble, peaceful. I have inherent worth and dignity. And yes, I realize that some of the two lists are direct opposites, and I am and can be both at once. As we heard in our first reading, we are complicated creatures. After doing all this work, it was time to write it all up, to come clean to my sponsor, my group, my spiritual director, my prayer group, my family. In short, it was time to tell my story. Just as with naming and facing a lot of the sins within me, saying it out loud to a group of caring people who I knew were in my corner no matter what I said, allowed me to be able to release it even more. Nothing was a secret anymore. I didn't have to be perfect anymore. And this brings up the point to not go into this journey lightly. I had so much support along the way. When we go into our brokenness, it is scary, it is difficult, and we should be very intentional about who joins us on the journey. You will need support, love, and forgiveness. We already have groups here where folks can share their journeys, their stories, and their soul with others. We have Soul Matters groups starting again in the fall. We have Smart Recovery groups, Candlelighter group, Buddhist Sangha, many other groups and circles, and plenty more I don't know about. All are opportunities to share your story and hear the story of others. Let your inherent wholeness emerge there. As we begin to learn the lessons of our brokenness, we do so with a faith in the inherent wholeness within each of us. If I didn't think that all this work would bear fruit of some kind, I definitely would not have stuck with it. As I started my spiritual direction program a year earlier than all of this, I set out with an intention of surrender. I felt I had done enough academic education. I needed a program of experience, and in my case, surrender. This is another word that may clang against your ears. Along with thinking about our powerlessness, many of us are skeptical of surrendering to anything like God or the universe or fate or whatever you want to call it. So when it came time to release these defects and false perfections, I had some experience of surrender to fall back on, but this was another level altogether. I realized I wouldn't just be surrendering once and for all. I have to surrender over and over again. I would not be able to do this without the faith that I was supported in unconditional love, that there was already an inherent wholeness within me, within you, and within all of creation. And lo and behold, if that hasn't been the case along this journey, I have been continually loved and affirmed by those that I have gathered around me and by the God of my understanding. My efforts are bearing fruit, too, as well. I find myself a bit more loving and compassionate, a bit bolder and more honest, filled with more gratitude and wonder. I find myself building more accountability, and my service is more grounded and sustainable. A couple of weeks ago, I was even holding a sign in front of City Hall as our reading and last hymn dictated. And as another sign says, when the introverts are there, you know it's bad. I wish I could say I'm totally free from fear or control or judgment, but they are all lessening. I can even leave the dishwasher as is when someone else loads it. At least most of the time. When I do feel fear rising within me, I try to name it, face it, surrender it to God, and simply move forward in spite of the fear, knowing that all will be well, and with the faith that healing is constantly available. My latest email signature quote is this from Stefan Molyneux. Be vulnerable, be honest, be open and show your heart. That's the best way of telling your heart that the tigers are no longer in the grass. My tigers are fewer, more spread out, and when I see them, I can face them and even walk around them. So that's part of my story. At the end of her story, Hannah Gadsby says, I don't tell you this so you think of me as a victim. I tell you this because my story has value. I tell you this because I need you to know. To be rendered powerless does not destroy your humanity. Resilience is your humanity. To yield and not to break, that is incredible strength. What I would have given to hear a story like mine, to feel less alone, to feel connected. Stories hold our cure. I needed my story heard, my story felt and understood by individuals with minds of their own. Your story is my story, and my story is your story. Help me take care of my story. That is the focus, the story we need, connection. So now it's your turn. Share your stories. Tell me your story over coffee. Tell your friends. Write a long post on Facebook. Share a video. Preach it loud and proud whenever you get the chance. Go to one of the groups here at Horizon. See a spiritual director or other companion. Be Jesus. Be a leper sometimes as well, and share how each of those felt. Then, when you get a chance to tell your story, step back and listen to others' stories as well. Go to Tuesday's Faith in Texas group meeting. You'll hear some stories there this week. When we share these stories and include the broken places as well, we share our common humanity. We give permission for others to share theirs, and we gain understanding and compassion for all those in our lives. We may even topple administrations, force resignations, create lasting change in ways we cannot imagine. Within these stories, our stories, all the stories that we hear, may we be shown the inherent wholeness and healing that is waiting for all of us. And may it be forever so. Amen.